So my name is Amy Farrell, and I am a professor at Dickinson College in American Studies and Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies. And my book is Intrepid Girls, The Complicated History of the Girl Scouts of the USA. And it's just as it sounds, it's about the Girl Scouts of the USA. And from their beginning in 1912 up through the present.
Awesome. Yeah. And I loved reading it. I was a Girl Scout technically until I was like 16. And my mom, who was like at this point, like a publicly problematic person because I've written so much about her, was my Girl Scout troop leader.
Okay.
So
Okay.
I,
So that's a pretty intense relationship with the Girl Scouts.
yeah, yeah. And she was great at being a troop leader, So there being like a cognitive dissonance in the Girl Scouts was something that like I just associated with my own experience. So it was kind of nice to see, I mean, not nice, it's pretty unpleasant how much cognitive dissonance there is in just between like what the Girl Scouts has always claimed to be and what they actually are and do. So I loved reading about it. It was really cool.
Oh, great. Good, good. Yeah, I actually I got into writing about the Girl Scouts because like you, I was a Girl Scout myself. So in fact, the cover of my book has a number of badges on it, and those are actually badges I had earned myself. I was in Girl Scouts from being about 9, 10 years old, well, actually through high school, but really it was through junior high that I was actually active. I had a very, very, very positive experience with Girl Scouting myself. I start the book saying it saved my life, and I think it really did in many ways. But I did the work with really thinking about this more with the eye of the big questions that interest me, thinking about race and feminism, and really the place of US empire. So those were I was thinking like, what was this organization that I was part of? That was really the question that kept motivating my research.
That makes a lot of sense. And one of the things I wanted to ask you is about the use of autoethnography in the book, because you do, your stories are peppered through and it starts with your experience. And I wondered, why you chose to do that when you did, like which stories to include and what they helped you communicate.
Yeah, thanks for asking that because it's not, this book is not a memoir, but there's a lot of memoir in it. Or I'm glad you're using the word autoethnography because that's really what I was looking for, was really having me think about beyond just a kind of psychological focus on why it was important to me, though that might have been, that would be a different essay, right? Thinking about why was the badge work important? Why were those leaders important to me? Um, I started it with the sentence of Girl Scouts saving my life because I want to establish that this organization was that important in my life. And I think that resonates not with everyone, but it resonates with a lot of people. There can be that kind of organization. In my case, it was Girl Scouts that was really central to raising me in some ways. But then I wanted to really drill down to say, look, these processes about how we learn about gender, how we learn about race. I am white and grew up in the 1970s in Northern Ohio. How we learn about race, how we learn about feminism or don't learn about it, how we learn what it means to be an American. Those things aren't just like processes outside of ourselves. Those happen on an individual level too. So I wanted to take that big picture and sort of drill down to like on my own level, how did I learn those things? So I start out with establishing that, the Girl Scouts were very important to me. But all the things in retrospect we didn't talk about. So I had really been a victim of bullying and sexual harassment at school. We never actually, it was a safe space, Girl Scouts was for me, but we never actually discussed, sexual harassment or bullying. We skirted around, especially any kind of question about feminism. Um, and then just I would choose throughout. To bring my own experience back in when I would see this relates to something bigger than I'm seeing here. So it wasn't like I planned ahead of time what I was going to, when I was going to be bringing in my own experience, but I would bring it in as relevant. The only caveat to that is there's one whole chapter that is focused on this big trip that we took, the I don't know if you did this when you were a Girl Scout, but the pilgrimage to the Julia Gordon Low birthplace in Savannah, Georgia. And so that's a moment because that was really key to my own experience of Girl Scouting. All the things we learned about travel and about earning money, etc. All those skills we learned, but then how we were simultaneously learning to be innocent about race. And so I take us on that journey, both to thinking about the myth of Julia Gordon Low, thinking about what was Savannah, what would Savannah have really been like while she was growing up versus the kind of stories that we were told. And then in particular, I really spend time and sort of almost stop the narrative for a little bit to have us think about the camp where we stayed, which was called, in what we learned was called the Girl Scout Plantation. It's actually Camp Low Country, but that was a common sort of nickname for it. And while we were being taught about things that were, Scarlett O'Hara and hoop skirts and the furniture and this, and the big house, etc., that we were actually staying over right on the grounds where enslaved people would have lived. And we didn't learn any of that while we were there. And and my point is we learned a lot of other things, so I actually I do spend a moment where the the kind of broader history comes to a kind of moment of interlude to say, let's actually linger here, and spend some time thinking about this place where we were.
I love that. And I didn't go on that pilgrimage. I remember other troops doing it. We did camp a lot though, and there's so many interesting things about the camping history, like kind of more, I guess, more modern Girl Scouts. But I'm interested in the children's mythologies of Low and how, this idea of the Girl Scouts as this international organization that was very like inclusive, and how that just wasn't true at all, in especially in the beginning and in really big ways. And I wondered if you wanted to talk about, just you spent a lot of time on that, and what is important about that, and how that spoke to you.
Right. Are you thinking, are you imagining more talking about Julia Gordon Low or talking about the organization as a whole in terms of diversity?
Right? It seems like one
Okay.
follows the other, right? So I don't
They
know. I
do. So
mean,
maybe
yeah.
I'll just, and you jump in. So, um, Girl Scouts really, as a national organization, focuses a lot on the story of Julia Gordon Low. And it's interesting because while she did found the organization in the United States, it was really created by hundreds, if not thousands, of women who really made Girl Scouting start. But the story of the Girl Scouts really focuses on Julia Gordon Low. So she was born in 1860 in Savannah, Georgia, to a family that was very wealthy. They had made their money through the cotton industry and the railroad industry, which were all completely dependent upon the slave trade, upon the ownership of enslaved people. So all of that wealth on her father's side, and on her mother's side, her mother was very wealthy from Chicago. Um, and that land, they had really made their money from explicitly taking land from indigenous peoples in the Chicago area. So we have money coming from, talk about two very difficult histories in the United States. That's where the money is coming from. None of that story gets told. So instead, we get told a story of her being a very curious little girl, a little bit eccentric. She gets married, and that this is true. She gets married in her 20s to a man from the UK, from Great Britain. He himself is also wealthy, His money came from being a cotton factor, so from the cotton industry as well. So all that wealth, again, is like it just keeps doubling up, that it's really based on enslavement. Um, she moves to England. Her family does not want to get her to get married to him because they think he is a gambler and a philanderer and a womanizer. And it turns out they're right. And he's just about to ask her for a divorce. He does ask her for a divorce, which is quite scandalous, and really shameful for her. But before that can happen, he dies, which is maybe sort of nice for her in a certain way. But then it turns out he leaves his money not to her, but to his mistress. And then she actually is intrepid and she sues for that money, which is a daring thing to do because she has to kind of go public with this whole divorce, threat of the divorce, etc. Um, and she comes back to the United States after this has all happened. She had befriended a man by the name of Baden-Powell, Lord Baden-Powell, who was um, the founder of the Boy Scouts in the UK. And so she brings the idea of Girl Scouts back to the United States. They were Girl Guides, but she changes the name to Girl Scouts. And so the story goes that she called her cousin and said, I have something for all the girls of Savannah and all the girls of America and all the girls of the world. And that is the quotation that gets repeated frequently to show the kind of inclusivity of the Girl Scouts. The reality was, in my research, I'm not quite sure that she actually ever said that. The evidence is pretty scarce that she actually said that. There are a lot of kind of reminiscences about her that are perhaps not true. And we also know that there actually had been small Girl Scout troops already started. She wasn't the one who really came up with this idea. But she had the best society ties, and she was able to kind of squash those other women's groups that were starting Girl Scouting. And she was never that interested in bringing Girl Scouting, especially to girls of color. Those first troops did have Christian and Jewish girls, but they were of a certain kind of social standing and they were white. And her mom, in particular, did not want her to include African American girls. She didn't want to make a big statement saying it was only white, but the reality was from the very beginning, Girl Scouting worked hard in the first decades. I'm not just talking about first years, but decades, to really limit the membership, especially of Black girls. Um, they had two things that are kind of policy oriented, but that are pretty key. One was a lone troop rule that lone troops, this was written in their policy, were only for the white race. And that meant those troops that would get started on their own, and then you'd have enough lone troops in an area that they'd form a council. So and generally, for a white woman who wanted to start that, it was pretty open. You just wrote to the national organization and said, I want to start this, and they would send you materials and off you'd go. But if you were not white, that was not the case. And in fact, when they'd get wind that a troop was not white or a leader was not white who wanted to start, they would stop it. What that meant was that then Black troops could only start if a white council member was then going to give their approval. The second policy, and that policy was that lone troop rule was in effect through the 1940s. And I would say it really lingered after that because the rule changed, but more in a technical way, that it could look like the Girl Scouts were more inclusive, but they weren't really. I can get into that if you want, or you can read the book and get into that where I explain that a little bit more. The other was local rule, which is this idea that while there is a national organization, it will give way to local practices. And that meant especially when it came to race. So if an area practiced racism, and I'm not just referring to the South, but that it was rampant in the South, but the North was true as well. And someone complained about it, the national organization would simply say, from afar, we can't really do much. We can't push beyond what a local area wants. And so that meant you would actually, in certain regions, actually have whole Black councils within a white council, like a completely segregated system. You would have in other places, and I'm thinking in the North in particular, but this happened certainly in the South as well, um, camps, which you were talking about camping. Camps were simply not be available to Black girls. And so, or they would only be available at the very end of the season, or possibly a situation in the North where they would allow one or two Black girls of very high social standing to join. And that really holds true through the 60s, I would say, that kind of policy. And even I grew up in the 70s in Northern Ohio, in Akron, Ohio. And that's part of the moment where I bring in my own story. My memory, although officially that camp desegregated in the 40s, it was a white camp. There was one Black counselor that I can remember, but otherwise it was an all-white camp.
Yeah, that is a bummer. I think a lot of this, it's really interesting because I feel like there's like a thread all the way through the entire history of the Girl Scouts, just at least in some ways of like kind of like a global kind of color blindness. I mean, with regards to race and class and politics and healthcare, it's just like whatever the Girl Scouts chooses not to acknowledge, like we just live in a different reality than the rest of the world. And it's really interesting, like how pervasive that is, like starting with the children's stories of Juliet Gordon Low. And what I found so interesting about those, like I always thought that those stories were the most boring part of Girl Scouts. Like I was just like, she seems like a total loser. Like I did not, I could not relate to this, like, whatever. Like the good parts of Girl Scouts for me were the edgiest parts, like when we were doing things that we weren't going to get to do in school, that when we were learning things. And to my mom's credit, and kind of like the vibe of the 90s at the time, is there was just really like a sort of the exotic other was a really big deal to white women in the 90s, I think, especially in the South where I was from. So there was just a lot of like woo about Buddhism and stuff like that. So we got to learn about other cultures a lot more in Girl Scouts, but I think that was just very specific and definitely not like across the board something that people were doing, and it was still problematic in the way that we did it, you know. But yeah, I'm really interested, and I was interested in this selling of the pearl story, like all of these different stories that kind of contribute to this fake reality.
Yeah, so that's I love that story about the pearl. So Juliet Gordon Low, and one of the things I start the book with really talking about this myth of Juliet Gordon Low and how it's changed over time. So someone asked me, are you out to sort of slander Juliet Gordon Low? And I said, no, I'm out. What I want to do is to trace the way these stories have changed, and more for us to look at why have the stories changed in this way, and what work do the stories really do for us? Because the reality was she was the founder, but there were so many different women who really made it happen. So this story works more like on a mythic level than it does on like that really she was in charge of it. By the early 20s, she had really dropped out of it and was focused more internationally. She dies in 1928. So really, in a certain way, she's out of the picture after not that long. But so, at any rate, the pearls. So one of the things that's funny is that as soon as she dies, the myth making about her starts. Like Girl Scouts realize it's useful to build her story. So there are these kind of reminiscences about her life that get published right away after she dies. And that's actually the heart of almost everything else that's been written about her comes from those memories that people wrote about her. Those first stories do not hide at all the fact that her life was a very elite life filled with lots of servants who had been enslaved people, and they actually often make fun of the people who were the formerly enslaved who were her servants, and make light of those kind of relationships. Um, by what they don't, what that original set of stories doesn't do though, is really tell anything about the fact that she had this unhappy marriage. By the 1950s, there's a new book that comes out that's a biography of her that starts to highlight the story more about her unhappy marriage. And what I surmise and focuses more about the fact that she had an unhappy marriage and that um, unfortunately she didn't have children, but the good news was that she had then all of these girls of America and all the world who were then her daughters, you know? So it sort of, I surmise that there was, especially in the 1950s, we know that there was so much concern nationally of accusations of communism and accusations of lesbianism were becoming really, those were something very dangerous to be accused of. And her life all of a sudden was looking a little problematic, you know, like once she came back to the United States, she basically made her life with other women. You know, she was really mostly interested in being with other women, and all of her work with Girl Scouts was with other women. She mostly just wore her uniform. Do you know, she liked to wear her uniform, which was a very kind of masculinist kind of attire. And so I have no idea. That was not my point. My point was though, I think it that started to look a little sketchy. And so Girl Scouts kind of revived the story of this unhappy marriage to at least make her seem safely heterosexual. It's just unlucky in love, do you know? And then by the 80s, 90s, some of the questions about her class status and these questions about race become problematic. And so all these like cute stories about the staff around her who were African American, who we know were actually formerly enslaved people, many of them, or their children, they just disappear. So it's not that they get kind of like, hey, maybe we should look at this, or this was a problematic part of her life. It's more like the world just becomes white, do you know? And like there's no that part of the story just gets excised even from films, you know, about sort of some of these early publicity films, it just gets excised. And other stories come to take the place. So, for instance, one about the pearls, which is that the Girl Scouts were having a little bit of a funding problem for a while, and she was just really distraught about that, and they needed some kind of influx of money, and so she sold her pearls. Like, I don't need the pearls anymore. Here they go. And it's such a great story of like her just saying, I don't need all these extra feminine accoutrements, and I'm going to do something that's just so meaningful for all the girls of America. The reality is, at least according to her biography, her biographer, Stacey Cordery, who focused just on her life, she did sell the pearls and she was really irritated because the money came through quickly thereafter, and she was really irritated she had sold her pearls. You know, but that's not the story that gets highlighted. So, and you know, so now I would say she often the story about her is just as badass woman. Do you know that she is this woman who was treated poorly in marriage and she sued her ne'er-do-well husband's estate, do you know, and she, you know, like fought for girls and women and you know, just makes her out to be like the daring woman who's just fighting for you know, basically democracy and inclusion for girls. And I would say, well, that's not quite true either, at least from the evidence that I've looked at.
Yeah, it seems like that way of framing her is really reflective of the Girl Scouts. Excuse me, overall. Like both are just really complex. Like there are stories in your book about specific Girl Scouts or specific troops trying to actually do good things, right? And like actually like trying to live up to these standards that are pretty cool. And there are also stories of how that failed and how they were really suppressing whole groups of people. And it seems like her life is kind of similar. Like it's like some things are kind of cool, like good for you for doing some of this stuff, but also, she was rich and super privileged and pretty racist, seems like, or at least doing things that ended
Yeah,
up
and that's
contributing to
yeah, thank
racism.
you. And that's why the book title has complicated in there. So I use the titles, like I really thought about that a lot and worked with the editor on that title. Intrepid, I chose that because Girl Scouts would never bill themselves as feminist. But intrepid, yes, courageous, adventuresome, unafraid, willing to do something daring. But also, this history is complicated, so it is not every time I would find a story of someone eh, who was fighting for inclusion or fighting to do good things. There's a flip side of it often too, and so it wasn't like I want us to say, um, "Oh, she was good," and then there were just these little problematic things. It's more like what happens when we put it all back together? It gets to be a more complicated picture, which is different than saying, oh, everything was good except for these little things that we can sort of ignore. It's saying instead, we need to look at this whole picture, and then how are we going to really think about that history?
Yeah, I love that. And it reminds me of like in the latter part of the book, I think about this often, and I feel like it's really illustrated in your book how like we can have this organization with a super complex history and just frankly the idea of girls in this country and like what are girls doing and what are they for and all this, girls are kind of like we only think about girls in specific ways in this country, or at least, earlier versions of girls. Like what were girls up to in, 1910? Like three things, right? Like we don't really like think about girls as like complex creatures very often in like a larger social and political way. But when somebody sort of goes viral talking about a group of girls, then that's the story that we have. We have one story, and it's like, are they super radical feminist or communist or something like that? And then that's the only story that we have. And we don't, it's either that or the opposite of that. And we don't really have the sort of framing and all of the details that actually make it an important conversation, perhaps, or at least something worth thinking about. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and absolutely it does. There's so much there. And one of the things I was thinking too is when she said, I have something for all the girls of Savannah, for all the girls of America, she's really thinking about a particular group of girls. She's she's thinking about white girls, and in terms of class, she is, I think, including class differences in there, but not like that you're going to challenge it too much. More like we're going to include everyone. Some people need to be helped. Some people can be helpers. Um, and and then in the other arenas, Girl Scouts were all over. Girl Scouts were in the Indian boarding schools, that were really about eradicating Native American culture. They were about uh, taking children away from families and really taking land away from Indian people in the United States. And Girl Scouts were there. Girl Scouts were in the internment camps. Girl Scouts also went anywhere where there has been a US base where families were based. Girl Scouts really have gone. So I think sometimes, girls get kind of left out of the historical narrative. And in fact, a lot of times when I would tell people about my project, they would kind of start to giggle, like a little bit embarrassed for me, like oh, like too bad you're using your good skills as a researcher to focus on this silly thing, And it's like, look, Girl Scouts were everywhere. And girls have been really key to not just creating what we think of as the United States, but also the United States as a whole has been really fixated on what are the girls doing, to come back to what you were saying, And this was sort of an arena in which that whole struggle was happening.
Yeah, I love that. It's interesting because like I was super embarrassed to be a Girl Scout. Like I just stayed registered because it frankly just kept my mom happy. And like I wasn't really active past like 11 or something like you said earlier. But still Like it was like the nerd thing to do after a certain age. And then like even when I first like saw the title, I was like, I've been to women's studies classes. I've studied like girlhood. I love the way that anthropology looks at girlhood and I'm so interested in it. But my first, the first thing was sort of like, okay, badges, like I just like sort of that's like the first impression that you get because we're just so taught, I think, to like minimize the importance of girlhood. But I what I love about your book is that it just like it again, it's like the complicating factor. It's like there's so much in Girl Scouts and girlhood about how we're taught to just be like helpers or to have like our value system sort of focused on, I think that I wrote it down, from idleness to mastery, but the mastery is focused on, you know, finding men, helping men, sort of supporting the like male world that we're inside. And just like how Girl Scouts can be like both an escape from that and a way of indoctrinating that is so fascinating to me. It's sort of like what it means to be a girl.
Yeah, and Girl Scouts, I would say, is that the one thing that's been true there, I mean, the Girl Scouts have changed a lot. The organization is so complex, it's hard to make big generalizations. But that is something that has maintained its truth, though, is trying to walk that fine line. Do you know, to encourage girls to have bigger space, to not always really be turning their attention by any means just to men, do you know, to be thinking about our own skills and competencies and meaning being created within community. And in fact, there's lots of stories for both feminist women like myself. I'm straight, but also from lots of colleagues and friends and other people who have been writing to me saying, this is where I learned about the possibilities of lesbian community, of queer community. We're in camps. Do you know that this was a space for this? Um, so all of that's happening, but it's also a fine line, so Girl Scouts never called themselves feminist. When I interviewed Frances Hesselbein, who was the CEO in the last part of the 20th century, I interviewed her when she was 103. It was an amazing experience, and she was still at work in New York City. So we were in Manhattan, and I'm interviewing her, and I mentioned the word feminism, and she just starts nodding her head, like shaking it, no. And I thought, what are you? I don't understand what's happening here. And then I realized because it's being recorded, she doesn't even want to have that word being said in this interview. Do you know, like just you don't go too far. And that was actually another title I played with a long time, which is A Dangerous Innocence. Do you know, so that Girl Scouts, I think, use that very much as a tactic to kind of hide so that they wouldn't get attacked for going too far. Um, and also the dangerous innocence of how it taught a certain form of whiteness, especially to its white members. Um, but I decided not to go with that title, but it's certainly a theme that goes through the book.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I'm glad that you brought up that interview. I think that's so cool. And it's so interesting to think now about how Girl Scouts is happening. My oldest child is a transgender boy and he was in Girl Scouts for like I think I managed to get through like a whole year, him and his sister, when before he transitioned. And it was a really disorganized troop and I wasn't that committed to doing it. They were just interested because they'd heard about it at school. So I was just like, sure, whatever y'all want to do, I'll take you and we can see what this is like now. But I often think like, what if he had stuck with it? He's a transgender boy, and so it's like like where is that fitting? And all of the stuff that you wrote about, just like how different troops are managing being more open to feminist topics or more inclusive topics now is fascinating to me, given the really hardcore rejection of that for like a lot of years.
Yeah, I think it really depends upon the troop in the council. Um, because it's not been the case for everyone. Some people have written to me about some of the issues that they're facing, that the national organization is certainly open to girls, to anyone who identifies with the girl experience or non-binary children. But they also are really, I think, relying on that local rule kind of policy there too, though, so that if a local council, so it's troops and then councils and then the bigger regions. But if a local council doesn't really support that, or if a local troop doesn't, they're not gonna come down hard. Now, that's not true though in some regions that I write about, like they've been very explicit, or some camps have, for instance, saying if this isn't good for you, like you're not happy to be sending your child someplace where um, we will welcome both counselors and kids of, queer kids, straight kids, kids who are non-binary. If that's a problem for you, this is not your camp. Do you know? So it's not like we aren't being inclusive, but we are saying there is a line where if you're going to have a problem with this, I don't mean they're not trying to please people's inner whatever, that's like, you have questions or you don't know what's going on. I don't mean that everyone has to toe some politically correct line, but more like if you're going to say, hey, I want to pull out Susie because, her counselor is non-binary or something. Do you know, they're saying like this is just not the place then for you to send. So that's interesting. I think there's the whole range of that happening now.
Yeah, I find that to be so interesting, and I think it's an interesting topic in with regards to like the part toward the end where you were writing about how there was this push to include STEM topics, but to sort of specifically avoid reproductive anything scientific about our bodies, and it's just like this avoidance of the body where I've been talking lately to a lot of people just in random conversations about how, because I grew up in the South, how so many girls like hook up with each other at slumber parties, and it just doesn't exist after it happened. It's like completely deleted from reality, but like I know for a fact that it happens a lot. And so it's like, but they would never talk about it for the rest of their lives. It's gone, never happened. And so it's like this, I don't know, I just wonder how much these kind of like policies and this like chasm between what's real and what's said like contributes to our, I don't know, disassociation from reality or something like that.
Yeah, that's an interesting point for me to consider there. The story about STEM was when I went back to visit my Camp Ledgewood in Northern Ohio, and it was actually the CEO of that whole region of Northeastern Ohio was showing me around the camp with some other women who were involved in STEM. And she was showing us the site of the new STEM kind of center. And I asked her, as some of the other women were going to look at this site, I said, so, hey, what kind of statements, since we're interested in making sure that girls have access to these kind of realms of power, or making sure they have skills that they can actually move into things when they're adults. Like, what's your take on the whole Dobbs decision and the fact that there's going to be so many restrictions on potential at that point restrictions on, possibly birth control, but certainly abortion. And it was like Hesselbein, just like silence. She like zipped me back onto the little cart. Like we were not going to talk about that. It was just, and she said, we're not political, and I thought, well, I'm just talking about the fact that if a girl gets pregnant when she's 13, um, it's gonna change her life. Do you know? It's gonna change her life even if she needs an abortion. It's a pretty big experience. She's 13, especially if she didn't have access to information about birth control or sex or safety in terms of like if this was actually a sexual assault. Um, And it's going to certainly change her life if she chooses to keep the baby. Do you know? So it's and if she doesn't have access to healthcare, I mean, it's just I just thought, okay, we're zipping along in camp here and this is all really sweet, but you know, I just think I think it's an interesting point. I mean, it the one really good thing I would say about Girl Scouts that I will stand by that was very good for me was literally learning levels of competence in things and doing things. I thought I should get a badge for like writing a book, like because I know how to break it into little steps, or for you for doing a podcast. Like you learn these skills and kind of being here now and doing these things, like be here now. You're just not always on a screen, like in some other world that's not connected to your own life. And that's extremely powerful, I think. But there is that disconnect. Now, having said that, when I went, I had an amazing experience going to our chalet, which is the International Center in Switzerland. And there they were running sessions on body image and body politics. And while I don't know, none of the girls who were in there asked questions about reproduction. They were young women leading the sessions and they didn't raise it, but if the girls had asked questions, I think they would not have shut them down. Do you know, like I don't know that for sure because I was only there to observe, not to interject, but it felt to me like it was really a space where they could have raised those questions and but having said that though the women the counselors didn't raise it themselves though.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's great to hear that at least they're talking about bodies a little bit more. And um, yeah, I really like I find it to be so interesting this just like dismissal of the political like that whole section was so fascinating to me. And I understand because like the accusation that Girl Scouts was like a communist organization really seemed to hurt their numbers and everything. But um it's just really strange because I feel like being a girl is just like this inherently political experience. Like people are constantly talking about your body in on TV, So it's
Yeah.
really weird to
Yeah.
like kind of just pretend that that's not happening. But I also had the similar experience where like I'm always feeling like I should get a badge for things. Like I love that frame of thinking. I was actually
Right.
telling my friend because I recently took my kids to a 3-hour Disney concert and I was like, and I like flew them to California, went to the concert, and then we flew home the next day. And I was like, I should get like an entire vest of badges. Like there were so many badges. Like I didn't have booze the whole time. Like,
Right.
like I actually like I was not snappy afterward. like um, but I think that
Travel
there's
badge. You should get the whole
yeah,
thing going there. Yeah.
so many badges. It's like all of Girl Scouts in
Right.
one trip. But there's something about just like focusing on what you've done and feeling good about that too, that self-esteem building thing that I don't think a lot of our um groups and organizations do in such a systematic way. And I do think that's valuable.
Right. And you do it because you literally have learned these skills or done these things, And so I think there is, and it's interesting to me. In fact, one of my professors in graduate school, an anthropologist, she is downsizing now, and she contacted me to say, congratulations on your book. And then she said, I just found my Girl Scout sash and some other things. Would you like it? And I said, absolutely. I mean, I really want this, so it's from the, early 1950s LA, her sash. But what I've also thought was really interesting is she has traveled all over she moved a lot. She, between all of her moves as a kid and then college, graduate school, moving to jobs, moving houses, then raising kids she's kept those. Do you know, like they haven't been tossed. And so there's something that I do think is profoundly powerful about the Girl Scout experience for many people, or that they will keep all of their paraphernalia, over these years. Or many of them have written to me with their powerful experience of rejection from it, or why their parents didn't let them join, or whatever it was, that I thought there's something big that happens that we can see sort of this bigger sweep of national history and identity and gender making and race making through these individual stories.
Yeah, I super agree. I think that's really true. And just the fact that you could like move anywhere and join a troop, or potentially join a troop is fascinating to me. I mean, it's I think the only thing that we haven't touched on that's like a pretty big theme in your book is sort of the imperialism part, which I love thinking about that frame. And just like I do think it seems like it's such a blind spot to so many of us for so many of our organizations, just like how the ways in which we are so dominant. But I wonder if you want to speak to that part because like it's sort of a thread through everything.
Yeah, absolutely. It is a thread through the whole book. And in fact, some of even the things that were happening in the United States were really seen through the 1960s, at least, as part of the imperial project because they were funded through the international fund. So even Native Americans were seen as part of the imperial project, Japanese Americans, part of the imperial project, really. But I think it's putting into place the fact that Girl Scouts were actually part of an international web to start with. So, she brings back the idea of girl guiding really from Lord Baden-Powell, who started the Boy Scouts and then with his sister, the Girl Guides in England, that were explicitly designed to build up, especially for the Boy Scouts, masculine character and strong boys into men to grow the British Empire. Like that was the explicit mission. And Girl Guides right there to help grow the empire. So when it comes back to the United States, um, Lowe does not have any problem with that idea, except that she's like, well, we'll compete for that. Like we are the other wing of this kind of imperial mission. Do you know that? And she really saw it. She was very much a fan of Kipling. She saw this very much as kind of white man's burden. Do you know that this was something good that the United States was doing, was to have its arm everywhere else. And this was kind of the soft arm of imperialism. Do you know that we're going to bring this to Girl Scouts everywhere? So England or the UK and the United States generally kind of competed where it could get places first. So you'll see if you see Girl Guides or Girl Scouts, it depends on England versus the US. And then also wherever we have had um, our military outposts, which is all over the world, just a tremendous number of them. If there were families there by any means or any level of family, so there would be some girls there, there almost always were Girl Scout troops, do you know? And so that kind of bringing Americanness and putting this kind of footprint of Americanness. And literally, those girls often, I read lots of their scrapbooks and things like literally seeing themselves as missionaries, but they weren't necessarily Christian missionaries, but missionaries of the United States, bringing that out into the world. Absolutely.
Yeah, it's so fascinating. I realize we've gone over time, but this is like such a super complex and cool topic. Is there anything else that you want to talk about or share, like maybe about the publishing process in general, like how the book came to be?
Yeah, so I've worked on the book for a little over 10 years. It's been a huge project, traveled all over the world to be gathering things for it. And uh, and then when I started really, working and talking to different kinds of different publishers, I had an agent and Tanya McKinnon who worked really well with me, and she just got my project right away. Um, and it was actually UNC. I talked to some more commercial presses, and I really liked UNC. And then it's with University of North Carolina, but then it's with their imprint Ferris and Ferris, and working with Debbie Gershenowitz. And I've just really loved working with them because they understood that this was a deeply personal project, a scholarly project, but I wanted it to be in a voice and a voice and a reach that would speak to all of the people I know would be interested in Girl Scouting or should be. Do you know, like that it shouldn't just be an insular kind of academic work. And it's been a real joy to work with them on this.